Right, we are recording now. I'll just do a very, very brief welcome. We'll keep things as informal as they have been so far. I'm really happy to have you all here again. Some of you here for the first session today. Some of you have been in several sessions of the first ever International Environmental Physiotherapy Festival that we're running at the moment. The festival and just like what's happening around it is nothing short of incredible. I've said this in the opening session before. About 4.5 years ago, no, I should roll back even further than that. About 5.5 years ago, Dave and I sat in a cafe together in Auckland, in New Zealand, on the North Shore in Albany. And we were doing the classic thing of, I believe we were writing on some kind of napkin as well, or maybe it was a piece of paper after all. And we were putting the words environment and physiotherapy on the same, napkin, piece of paper. And then, and also the year after, when we started the Environmental Physiotherapy Association, saying environmental physiotherapy could essentially be equated to declaring yourself insane. We wrote this editorial together in a relatively swift move, call for a new environmental physiotherapy, to just see and reach out if other people would also be interested in exploring what the potential link between these two might be, right? And I think maybe quite naively, we just wanted to see how this would go and who else would be interested. Well, suffice to say that about 4 years later, we're more than 1,000 people that are interested in this topic, and the topic is evolving in all sorts of different directions. People are exploring the connection between environment and physiotherapy in so many different ways, right? To Dave and me, being interested in not just physiotherapy, but also philosophy a fair bit, we've always really wondered about sort of the more fundamental kind of connection between the human health and the non-human environment, ecology, call it what you will. And so I think this is what you'll hear Dave talking about a fair bit today. About Dave, if you don't know him, you should know him. He's a very prolific professor in physiotherapy. He's the world's first, I think, professor in critical physiotherapy, for what it's worth. And once you'll hear his talk, I think you will also come to realize he's also probably the world's first professor in environmental physiotherapy. So it's with great pleasure that I can hand over the word to Dave and his chickens, as we talked about before, to talk us through a session on what the wind is saying to us.
Thanks, Philip. And thanks everybody for coming along. There's a couple of people I know here. I know where you are, but it would be really nice in the chat feed if people wouldn't mind just putting in the chat feed where they're dialing in from right now, just to get a sense of where you are in the world. I'm obviously in Auckland. I'm in Auckland, New Zealand. It's about just gone 6 a.m. here. And it's amazing to be able to do this. And I know people are going to do this a lot because there's a lot of events coming up in the festival, but I just want to acknowledge Philip's work here, because this is astonishing, what you're doing, not just in terms of the festival, but just everything with the EPA is really an amazing piece of work. So thanks, Philip, for the invite and the opportunity to do the keynote, but also to the organizing committee for putting this on. I also want to acknowledge a good friend and colleague of mine who's here this morning, Paul Lagerman, who has listened to parts of this talk. We sat in Galbraith's pub about 5 weeks ago, and I went through this talk with him bit by bit, and we had a good hour or two mulling it over, and have been talking about it and thinking about it since. So thanks, Paul, for the help with this. I hope that I managed to make sense of all of this. The time slot I've got is a couple of hours, but I don't think it'll take that long to work through. And it very much depends, really, I suppose, on how much we extemporize or explore some of this stuff. The basic format for the talk is actually a series of questions that are all around the topic of therapy. And I'll explain why in a second, but it's not in the sense of having just a linear talk that just rolls from one to another. There's a series of questions in here, some of whom I think I have resolved in my own mind and understand. Some of them I'm at the very early stages of trying to understand, but they seem to be relevant questions to me anyway. So just to put this into context, for the last 20 odd years, my biggest project, I suppose, has been what I think of as trying to diagnose physiotherapy. much like you would diagnose a client, a patient, I've been interested in physiotherapy as a phenomenon, how it came about, why it came about, whose interest does it serve, whose voice is heard, whose voice is not heard, why it does the things it does, why it's facing the tensions it's facing, where those tensions come from, the historical and social conditions that make physiotherapy even possible. And it all works on the presumption that physiotherapy is a reasonably recent historical invention. It's only existed for just over 120 years. But it uses practices that go back to the dawn of humanity. I mean, the physical therapies, massage, touch-based therapies, hot and cold, even electrical therapies, water-based therapies, movement, manipulation, exercise. They're things that almost, I think, probably are the first known medical remedies for things. So what creates the conditions for a profession like physiotherapy to exist for this last 100 years? Does it mean it's going to exist forever? If it's a temporary blip, I suppose, in the history of humanity, but the physical therapies are there continuously, what happens if physiotherapy stops being physiotherapy? What happens if it disappears just as quickly as it came? So 2017, I published a book called The End of Physiotherapy, which was essentially trying to collate some of the history of what Foucault called a history of the present. So the historical conditions that made the present physiotherapy possible. And it tried to address some of the reasons why physiotherapy was facing the challenges and problems that it was. And if you've read the book, you'll know that one of the kind of main arguments is that the body as machine was both a vital idea for early physiotherapists to grasp onto, because it allowed them to demonstrate their legitimacy and they could touch people without fear of scandal, but also it established their orthodoxy as an agent of the state and an ally to medicine. And that was very important. But that very problem, that very idea of the body as machine, had increasingly become problematic as the population demanded different kinds of things from healthcare. Neoliberal economic reforms meant people's demands had changed. And so physiotherapy was looking to have to change from that old ideology, but didn't know how, because the other thing about the body as machine was it made you focus on the anatomy and physiology and pathology of the body. It didn't teach you about the history or the sociology or the philosophy or the theology of health. And so we were struggling because we didn't have the tools, the language to escape the body as machine and find a different definition of what physiotherapy could be. So that was the end of physiotherapy. 2022, I wrote a second book, which was followed on from that, called Physiotherapy Otherwise, which did a similar kind of project of trying to diagnose physiotherapy, but using sociology, and particularly the sociology of the professions, to argue that it isn't just physiotherapy that's facing a lot of these challenges. This is happening globally, and we are entering what's now known as a post-professional era, which means that the professions themselves, all of them, are gradually being pushed to the margins as voices of expertise. So as a simple analogy, it used to be that to understand anything about medicine, to become a doctor, you had to train in a medical school, which gave you access to those dusty libraries of Index Medicus books, those big fat books with all of the references listed in. And that's the only way you could obtain medical knowledge. Well, nowadays, pretty much everything that's in a medical curriculum is available online. And that democratization of knowledge is really challenging medicine's ability to say it is the expert. And it's the same for all of us. So Physiotherapy Otherwise was moved this project on. When Physiotherapy Otherwise was finished, I always had in mind the idea of writing a 3-part series, with the third part being philosophical. So the sort of metaphysics of physiotherapy and the philosophies that underpin it. And so for the last 3 or 4 years now, I've been immersed in postmodern, post-critical philosophy. I've read Foucault a lot for my doctoral thesis back in 2004 or 5. But I've increasingly been reading people like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari's books feel to me to be the mainstay of the arguments that I want to make about the philosophy of physiotherapy, and not just physiotherapy, but the physical therapies themselves. And what they're really good at, the work of Deleuze and Guattari are really good at, is breaking away from the idea that you have to think about health biologically or psychologically or socially. That kind of biopsychosocial triangle is too constricting for them. And rather than trying to argue that they occupy a space within that triangle, that Venn diagram, they just put the whole thing to one side and they create what is essentially a closed system of philosophy that is radically different to anything that you would read in conventional philosophy. And for the last couple of years, a group of us, actually, quite a number of people here, have been reading some of Deleuze and Guattari's work together. And I can think of probably maybe 9 or 10 physios that I know of now who are actively using Deleuze and Guattari's work, because I think as a small group, we see that there's something in that. So I've been starting out trying to do some of the work to prepare for a new book that might be written in a couple of years' time. I don't know, but testing out some of these ideas. Now, at the end of Physio Otherwise, one of the main points I came to was that there's something about the physical therapies that means that they've endured for these last 3, 4, 5,000 years. That regardless of historical change or whatever's happened in the world, those physical therapies have been there. But I think that what I argued was that there's something that I called, after Deleuze and Guattari, intensities, something that is inherent to those physical therapies that is impossible to pin down and describe and name, but is there nonetheless. And these intensities are an idea that comes from Deleuze and Guattari, and is quite a complex philosophical idea that's bound in a lot of kind of issues. But last year, I did quite a bit of writing about the nature of touch and what is touch and when does touch begin and end. And more recently, I've been trying to tackle the question of therapy. Now, you would think, given that therapy forms half of the name, physiotherapy, you would think that we would have a really strong interest, theoretically, in knowing what therapy was, or at least knowing what therapy was for us. You would think that there'd be a ton of literature in physiotherapy that says, okay, let's put all the technical stuff aside for a minute. Let's just stop and just explain what therapy is. Well, actually, there is none. That I can see. There is no serious scholarship that actually attacks the question of what is this therapy that we claim that we are experts in? What is this therapy that is half of our name? Now, it's kind of akin to, in my mind, to psychologists having no interest in talking about the mind, having nothing to say about the mind, or occupational therapists saying nothing about occupation, or nurses saying nothing about care. I mean, these are fundamental concepts to those professions, and there are library shelves full of stuff that relate to those concepts in those professions. There is nothing in physiotherapy about what therapy means. So it seemed to me to be an interesting thing to pose some questions about therapy and to see if I could get to the bottom of what therapy might be for us. So let me just move through here. Here are a few things that I think we could say. Conventionally speaking, if you asked most physiotherapists, they would agree that therapy was. I think they would say that it's done by people for people, either individually or collectively. I think they would say that it's a conscious act. It's something that's purposefully done for people. They would say, I think, that it's relational, that it always requires another. Therapy is done for another person. There's always a binary. There is always two involved, at least two. That it's something beneficial, something good. That it requires a degree of skill to administer. It's not just the accidentally bumping into people. That it is in some ways distinct from healing, caring, or mere help. That it's episodic, that therapy begins here and ends there, and that in some ways it's confined to the immediate actors in the environment. So there's me, the therapist, you, the patient, and we're in this clinic room, and that's where the therapy happens. Now, I think that you can see that not just if you asked, excuse me, if you asked physiotherapists for opinion, I think you'd also see that in the literature. So here are 6 articles I culled just in the last couple of weeks from Physiotherapy and Practice Journal, Physical Therapy, Physio Research International, the Journal of Physio, and Physiotherapy, the UK Journal. These are just articles that in some way reference therapy. And you can see that those, if I just jump back for a second, that list, you can see that those traits of therapy appear to be there. So I wanted to try and ask the question about what's assumed here. And the subtext of all of this is that I think therapy is much bigger than physiotherapists have given credit for. And I think it actually is big on a scale that we haven't quite appreciated. And I think you need to move beyond pragmatics to understand what that scale might be. I think you have to move into the realm of philosophy and metaphysics to really try and understand it. And that's not easy work, particularly for a profession who's trained in anatomy and physiology and biomechanics. But it's necessary work because quite clearly physiotherapy is trying to expand. It's moving into new territory, but it's doing it somewhat blind without really knowing where to go or how far to go. And I think the I was going to say unwritten remit, I think it's almost overt remit of the Environmental Physio Association is to challenge those concepts of where it goes, and particularly to see physiotherapy in a much more sort of ecological, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, ecological position. I think all of us believe that physiotherapy is quite remarkable, or the physical therapies are remarkable, but that we haven't really captured what they are doing. And so what I'm trying to do here is tackle this in a series of questions that I'm posing to therapy, if you understand what I mean. Asking therapy, what does this mean? Is that true? Does that idea hold? To try and get a sense of just how big it is, where the boundaries are. So what you're going to see is a series of questions, and I've interspersed the questions with some poetry and some imagery. There are breaks, kind of mental breaks in here where I've just taken some footage from actually my garden. And they're just meant to be kind of reflective pauses. And to some of the questions, I have no answers and I won't talk or say much. For some of them, I'll try and offer some thoughts that I've had. So if we try and get into this, then the first thing I want to tackle, if we go back to those key points, is that therapy is done by people for people, which seems to be one of the fundamental principles behind physiotherapy. So I've titled this section "Person-Centered Therapy?" ? Okay, so the first question that I think we ought to pose about therapy is it exclusively human? Or in a different way of saying this same question, is therapy limited to humans? Is therapy by us for us? Now, in physiotherapy practice, in physiotherapy literature, with one or two exceptions, but I think particularly of hippotherapy, animal therapies, the work of people like Thomas Sudman, who's well known to a lot of you, physiotherapy is almost exclusively done by humans for humans. And yet, you only have to scratch the surface of that concept to realize that doesn't really quite make sense, because therapy itself, regardless of how we use it, cannot be just limited to humans. I mean, there are animal species that are therapeutic. If the dog rests its chin on your knee and looks at you with his doleful eyes, or in my case, a chicken, comes and talks to you, it's incredibly therapeutic. People will find it therapeutic to walk in the woods, in the sunlight. People will find it therapeutic to go on holiday. There are lots of things that are not human that have the capacity to be therapeutic. So I think one of the first things we have to reject straight away is that therapy can be confined to just humans. Now, that immediately challenges what the notion of what the therapy in physiotherapy is, because if you think about this, and we're going to get into this in a lot more detail, one of the questions you then have to ask is then what is doing the work of therapy? Because if the sunlight, if walking in the woods on a sunny day can be therapeutic, what is it that's doing the therapy? So then let's tackle another of the kind of axiomatic assumptions about therapy, that it's always a conscious or deliberate act. Well, we know that's not true, because there are many times when I could do something with a patient that is therapeutic for them, but I didn't mean it. I didn't intend it. It wasn't that I was deliberately going out to do that thing. And yet they found it therapeutic, regardless of my intention. So the fact that I might not be consciously aware that I'm doing something, it means that my mind doesn't control when something is therapeutic. The therapy is happening regardless of my mental state. You'll notice that the quotes appear in this kind of pink text, and you'll see my face disappear from the corner. And the same with the poetry, which is generally blue and green. My face disappears, and when those things happen, I'll just shut up and let you read the thing, because they are curated to flow in context with the questions at the same time. Okay, so a third, if we can't say that therapy is restricted to humans, and we can't say that it's a conscious, deliberate act, because it happens when I'm not thinking about it, then is it in the mind of the other person? Is it just in the reception of the idea? So I didn't mean for that to be therapeutic, but the person felt it themselves anyway. Well, we know that's not true, because there's lots of therapeutic things that I would do. I was a respiratory physiotherapist in my earlier years and worked in intensive care units and neonatal intensive care units. And there were many of the patients I saw that were unconscious, and yet I was doing therapeutic things for them. They weren't consciously aware that I was even there on a level that I was aware of. And then again, we get back to this question of what's doing the therapy, because if I was doing, say, something like manual hyperinflation, and I was driving air into a person's collapsed lung, was it me, Dave, that was the therapeutic agent? Was it the rebreathe bag? Was it the properties of the oxygen and the air flowing into that person's lung? What was doing the therapeutic work? And none of that was necessarily in the mind of the person. When the oxygen went across the blood barrier and into the mitochondria, the patient wasn't aware of that on a conscious level, and yet it was doing therapeutic work. So I think already we're saying we can't call therapy just human. It can't be just a conscious act on our part, and it can't be just in the mind of the other person, which are three fundamental ideas that underpin how we think about therapy. But let's just suspend this for a second. Hypothetically, if therapy was exclusively human, we'd have to answer the question, where does it reside? And this question, I think, is a really interesting question to ask of anybody who has a new idea about therapy. Paul and I have talked at length about this question in relation to chronic pain and the adoption of the biopsychosocial model, about how we used to know where pain resided because it lay in the tissues. The pain was there. And now there are a lot of people who are advocating for the pain not being in the tissues. The tissues are not the issues, to use the kind of jargon. Well, where's it gone? I think there's a reluctance from a lot of people to actually articulate that, what they think, where they think the pain's gone. Has it gone into the spirit world? Has it gone into the person's mind? I don't mean their brain, because that's just another tissue. But has it gone into their mind in a kind of phenomenological sense? Is it part of their existence? Has it gone into the social domain and become a linguistic concept that has no biological reality? People have been very reluctant to actually articulate where that pain has gone to. But we have to be able to say where it is in order to be able to articulate what we think it is as a concept. And it's the same with therapy. Going back to the manual hyperinflation thing, is Dave the agent of therapy? Is the air the agent of therapy? Is an oxygen molecule the agent of therapy? Is the relationship between the oxygen molecule and the mitochondria the agent of therapy? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm saying that, though, when we start to think about what we mean by therapy, actually being able to locate it and say where we think it resides is a critical point. And one of the other things that we probably should do is we should challenge this question about what the human is anyway. And I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but this is a really serious point, because if you take, again, going back to my respiratory physio experience, there's an example I've written about quite a lot, which is that if there's an oxygen molecule floating in the air, I'll try and point where you can see me, in front of me, let's say a couple of meters away in this room, there's an oxygen molecule. Now, in about 10 seconds, I might breathe that oxygen molecule in. At what point does that oxygen molecule become part of me, Dave? Is it in my trachea, which is just sort of an invagination of the outside air anyway? Is it in my alveoli? Is it when it crosses into the plasma or absorbed into the mitochondria? Is it when it's in the muscle? Now, it's quite an important question, because 60% of my body mass is made up of oxygen. There's more oxygen by mass than there is carbon in my body. So I've got a lot of investment in that oxygen molecule. The 60% of me is made up of that stuff. But I call it me. But when did it become me? Because if I accept that the oxygen molecule 2 meters away is already part of me, then I have to accept that the oxygen being produced by the Amazon basin will at some point potentially come to me and be part of me, in which case, where do I begin and end? When we sweat, when we defecate, when we urinate, when we breathe, when we think, when we shed skin, and our bodies are constantly interchanging with the environment. When we eat and drink, we take things in, that becomes part of our body. It's very hard to distinguish what a human is in reality. I mean, there's a fiction, and you can pretend that the human is a uniform, autonomous, sovereign being. But even on any level, the human, psychologically, biologically, physically, socially, is a very porous, fluid structure that's constantly in flux with the environment. And there's very little that differentiates between the inside and the outside of me. So this adds to the complexity of saying, well, what is therapy for Dave then? And is Dave the therapist? So sticking with this fantasy for a moment, though, just to think it through, if therapy is exclusively human, what name should we give to the therapeutic things that non-human entities do? So what I mean by this is, let's argue that therapy is just a human construct, that it's a word we use to describe a certain set of things we do in a clinic on a Thursday morning. Fair enough. We can do that. But what we've got to do is account for all the therapeutic things that are happening outside of that space. So another example that I wrote about when I was writing about touch was of a leaf on a tree. I love this example. A leaf falls from a tree in autumn and lands on the soil and decays. And in decaying, it feeds the soil, and the nutrients pass into the soil, and then they form the nutrients that plants need for the next season in spring for the next plants to grow. That seems to be an act of therapy, just like my hand touching a person's skin. I struggle to see really much difference beyond the fact that one is done by a supposedly human and one is done by a tree. They are therapeutic acts. One is helping the other, if you want to refer to it that way. So if we want to keep therapy just for humans, that's fine, but we're going to have to invent a whole new vocabulary for that stuff that's going on in the wider cosmos all the time, everywhere, infinitely more than our acts of human therapy, all the time. And that vocabulary has to be distinctive so that we can see where the boundaries lie. We have to be able to distinguish between my act of putting my hand on somebody's skin and the act of a leaf touching the skin of the soil, and the million other examples we could give of that. So I think the idea of claiming therapy as a human domain is understandable, but I think it's fraught with difficulties. So one of the arguments that you sometimes see, particularly from biologists, animal and plant psychologists, and yes, there are such a thing as plant psychologists, which I found quite amazing, is the argument that because humans are conscious, sensate, and have this kind of higher ability to be reflective, that we would think of therapy as something that we can initiate and be consciously aware of and do when we want to, willfully. But for other species, other entities, it's just a natural expression. So there's a lot of examples, for instance, of ants doing what you might see as therapeutic work. There's a lot of research which looks at ants and termites, actually. An ant gets injured in a colony, and the ants in the colony has been shown to actually go and gather up that ant and take the ant back into the colony and feed it. It looks almost like sort of human style caring. There are examples. A colleague, one of my colleagues, is a supervisor of a student, and he's a biologist in Japan, and he studies chimpanzee behavior. And he's written an article with colleagues looking at the behavior of a troop of chimpanzees. And during the course of their normal daily business, one of the young chimps, falls from a tree, has a big fall, and is knocked unconscious, and is quite injured and is bleeding. And the attitude of the other chimps looks like caring. You might look at it and say, well, they were cleaning the blood off its face. They were nervous. They were hanging around. They were expressing concern. And these biologists notice this because they know these chimps. They know their behavior. They can recognize a rupture, a change in their pattern of behavior. But people will say, well, that's just, they don't have our cognitive abilities. They're just acting out some biological instinct. And you see, and most of the literature in animal psychology and plant psychology is based on that premise, that it's just an ant just has an instinct to do this. So this question about in what ways then does a therapeutic act consciously elevate that therapy, or whether therapy is actually quite rudimentary and is just an instinct in all of us on some level, but just humans have quite clearly some additional conscious ability to add layers of meaning to it or to implement it strategically, is something we don't really know, because much of the research has been dominated by biologists and psychologists who by virtue of their training are looking for instincts and patterns and reflexes, and particularly patterned forms of cognition in animals, just like they do in humans. So this is something I haven't really got my head around, whether we can just say it's a natural process for them and something that is a higher process for us. I just realized I said at the start that a lot of that footage is taken from my back garden, and that is not my back garden. Okay. So having tackled or tried to tackle some of the questions about person-centeredness of therapy, and the basic sum up from all of that is, I think that first point about therapy is done by people for people doesn't hold on really any level. We have to put that to one side completely. And I also think the question about it's a conscious, deliberate act also has to be questioned as well, not least because we know that there are many therapeutic things that happen in the world to which we are not at all conscious. So I wanted to tackle next this question of agency, because this seems to be important in thinking about touch, therapy rather, because of who's doing the therapy? Who's responsible for it? I wanted to phrase this in a slightly different way, though, to ask what does the work of therapy? Because I think to get away from the who, which kind of has a human implication, I think by asking what, it opens up a whole range of possibilities. For instance, maybe the oxygen molecule is the therapeutic agent. It's not Dave, or it's not the manual rebreathe bag. It's the oxygen molecule that does the work. In which case, which bit of the molecule? A molecule is a collection of things. So is it the particular wave patterns, the electromagnetic waves that give off? Is it the force, the magnetic force around the atoms? Is it the atoms themselves? Is it the combination of the atoms? Is it something to do with the atoms when they link up with another thing? All of these things we kind of don't really know, but if we're going to allow that oxygen could be therapeutic, we need to answer the question, well, what's the agent actually doing the therapeutic work? I think one of the things I wanted to add with some of these quotes as well is just an indication that out there in different spheres of practice and thinking, in the arts, in philosophy, in sociology, in cultural studies, in lots of different places, um, there are pockets now of people really starting to think about this stuff. The eco-philosophy space is now really, really massive. And there are places there where we can get a lot of help and support for thinking through some of these ideas. So we're pushing on into some quite challenging stuff here in some ways, because we've got to ask at this point then, well, can inorganic entities be therapeutic? Can an oxygen molecule be therapeutic or express or possess some therapeutic properties? Are there some inorganic entities that are therapeutic and some that have no therapeutic properties whatsoever? They're inert in a sense. We don't know the answer to that. But if I'm going to manually hyperinflate a person's chest and think I'm the therapist, but I'm not the therapist and something else is, I want to know what that is. So we have to entertain the possibility that maybe physical structures, biological structures, even psychic structures, dreams. I mean, if you take something like somebody reads Anna Karenina, the book, and finds the act of reading the book therapeutic because it lifts them out of a state of mind, a mood that they were in. So what is it about Anna Karenina, which is a fictional character in a book, for that person that is therapeutic? We've established it. It might not just be in the person's mind. It might not be in the book. It might not be just a conscious thing. It might not even be a human thing. So what is the therapeutic agent? We know that a walk in the sunshine can be therapeutic. We say that dreams have therapeutic properties, but is it the properties themselves then that are therapeutic? If so, which properties? Are some properties naturally therapeutic in and of themselves? So if, for instance, I'll just drop back a second. If you have a particular pattern of electromagnetic signals, is that therapeutic? If you have a dream of chickens, is that therapeutic? As opposed to a dream of cows, which isn't. This is stuff we have no real answer for. So if we take this next question then from the perspective of the entities themselves, so if you can, the tendency is always to think about therapy as coming from us to other people. But if you're an oxygen molecule and you're just coming into contact with mitochondria, what about the mitochondria? What about the dream? What about the leaf falling from the tree? Is therapy the same for all of them? Are there different graduations of therapy? Are there some things that are more therapeutic and some things less? Is there a scale here? Are there different types of therapy? Are there different kind of effects? What are the graduations? Why do they happen? Why are some forms of therapy attached to some entities and some processes and not others? This in some ways kind of regresses, but it's related to this question of agency. But it goes back to one of those early axioms of, I think, physiotherapy, which talks about it's a skillful act. It's something that separates those who have skill in therapy from those who don't. Does therapy imply a high level of function? Do you have to possess any skill to be a therapist? I think you can have skill and be a therapist, but I don't think it follows logically that you have to. If we accept that an air molecule can be therapeutic in and of itself, would you call that a skill? I don't think I would. I'm not quite sure I know what a skill would mean in that context. But equally, I don't necessarily think that therapy is just a natural disposition. So something that is just going back to that question about can inorganic entities be therapeutic? Humans have this consciousness, so we can deliberately be therapeutic. But for animals, plants, and inorganic bodies, biologists argue, no, it's just an expression of their natural tendencies. They have no thought to apply therapy. I think that example of the apes caring and ants and termites caring for their fellow ants makes that assumption questionable about people's ability to be therapeutic when it's necessary. I'm not entirely sure that's not also true of everything across the universe, but I have no way of proving that assumption. But it seems like the idea of possessing a skill to be a therapist, if you were to redefine the notion of skill and call skill this disposition towards therapy that could be part of every entity, then I suppose that would be reasonable. But that means you have to redefine skill away from something you'd learn at college, which seems a very narrow definition of skill in the context of all of this. This is a sort of political question. If oxygen does the therapeutic work, what right do we claim to call ourselves the therapist? If we tackle this question of therapy and we really democratize it and open it up to more scrutiny, what I hope it reveals is that therapy is a much broader has a much broader constituency. There are many other things involved in therapeutic work than just physiotherapists or psychotherapists or such, or occupational therapists. I think it challenges politically our claim to own therapy on any level. And I think that's going to be an interesting political question for other people probably in the profession to debate as to whether they're prepared to give up on that special claim to therapy in the face of evidence that says, well, actually, therapy is much more widespread than we give it credit for. Before we move on, do people want to take a break for just a couple of minutes, just stretch their legs? And I'm happy to stop and or press on, whatever you prefer. Just pop a note in the chat feed if you want me to stop for a couple of minutes.
I think we can just carry on.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things then, if we move away from agency and the individual position of therapy as something held by one thing or not, one of the ways we have to think about therapy is perhaps whether it's relational. Now, what I mean by relational here is if you have any two entities coming together and there's a connection between them, as opposed to an entity nearby that there is no connection with, but an entity with which there's a connection. Maybe the therapy isn't held by either entity one or entity two. Maybe the therapy exists only in the line between them. It's created in their relation between them, in that interstitial space between the two entities, and isn't the possession of any one of the two things themselves. So that necessitates some other in the therapeutic act. And going back to one of those axiomatic ideas that therapy always demands another, that seems to uphold that idea that therapy could be primarily relational, doesn't exist outside of a relation. So the oxygen molecule on its own can never be therapeutic, only develops a therapeutic principle when it's in relation to another thing. And so it's actually in the line between them where the therapy resides. So it raises this question: does therapy imply some kind of collaboration between entities? Does it demand a relationship with another? The alternative is that you would say that an entity has therapeutic properties, whether it meets any other encounter with anything else ever at all, it still would have therapeutic properties. One of the ways we tend to think about therapy is through our senses. And one of the ways in which I think physiotherapy and the physical therapies has a real power in this respect is because all of the senses, and now I think there are more than the 5 that we know of. There are 40 odd different senses that people have acknowledged and recognized. But if we stuck with the main ones, all of the senses bar one can be done independently. They're like the entity that exists in a vacuum. So you can see somebody else without them seeing you. You can hear something without the other hearing you. You can smell and you can taste others without that also tasting you. But you can't touch without the other person being touched. So in a sense, touch might be the cardinal therapeutic sense through which this kind of relational question can be explored. But does it mean that sight or smell or taste or hearing cannot be therapeutic? Or does the act of hearing already, or sight already, imply some kind of connection? So I think we're getting to the kind of crux of this issue about the relationship of what a relation that is therapeutic. Can an entity be therapeutic in isolation, in and of itself? In which case we are situating therapy in the entity rather than in the space around the entity or in relation. So if we're thinking about the nature of therapy then, and we're thinking about where it resides, one of the things we have to think about is what kind of thing therapy is. Is it the property of an entity? So if we take this pen, for instance, you could say this pen has a particular weight. It's got a gray color. It has particular patterning on it. But these are all properties of that pen. You could strip those properties away. That pen could be red and it would still be a pen. It could have red ink, not black ink. It could be different. It could be heavier or lighter. It's still a pen. So those are properties of the pen that define it. It's what Husserl talked about as adumbrations or shadows or things that attach to the object, that phenomenological method is an attempt to peel away to get to the essence of the thing itself. but it's a very much a consideration for what are the properties of the thing itself. Maybe there's a property of that pen called therapy that could be peeled away, just like the gray color could be replaced by something else. But it's a property of the pen. That's a different idea to saying that, no, it's actually not a property at all. It's a process. It's an event. It's something that happens that's outside of the pen itself. But when that pen meets a piece of paper, it's the process and the event of that pen meeting the paper that then becomes therapeutic. So in a sense, the therapeuticness resides out there as a potential in the cosmos, in the universe, for anything and everything to access. But under certain conditions, when certain thing meets another thing, that process is mobilized and eventuates it and happens. So that idea that it's out there as a, like time is out there as a kind of empty vessel, a placeholder for time to be applied. Therapy is the same. If we take time as an example, I might decide it's now 5 to 7 in the morning. I've got a clock that ticks in seconds. I've applied a particular way of thinking about time, but time is there nonetheless. If I hadn't thought about the time and applied that kind of approach, it wouldn't make time disappear. Time would not stop. It's always there. Maybe therapy is always there, and then sometimes a thing picks it up and uses it. So rather than it being a thing, a property of the thing itself, maybe it's something out there in the cosmos, in the universe, that anything can access if the conditions are right and the relationship is right. Now, that kind of idea of a process is interesting because, of course, it does allow for a conversation about the politics of therapy. Because in the human world, for instance, who gets access to that process, that event? Who gets access to that thing that is universally available, and who is denied it becomes a really important political question. In physio otherwise, for instance, I'll play this in a second. In physiotherapy otherwise, one of the arguments I made was that physiotherapy profession had essentially enclosed the physical therapies, had taken them for itself and said that you can't have these things that have been practiced by humanity for thousands of years. You can't have them, you can't use them unless you've gone through our training and you've been registered by us. And so that act of colonization was a political act that stole or took away therapies from people that had always been available and legislated to protect them. And so hence the argument at the end of physiotherapy otherwise that one of the acts, political acts that the profession should engage in now is an ethical act of returning the therapies to the commons. So in a sense, it's kind of trying to open physiotherapy up back to the idea that therapy might exist as something that's democratically available, not just to every human, but to every species, every entity, every virtual or real, actual, imagined, everything in the cosmos has potentially access to therapeutic work. Look in the top left corner of this picture. We've had 2 blackbirds nesting in that hedge on the left this spring, and that's Linda. She's called Linda, and her partner's Paul, after the Beatles song Blackbird. And so Paul and Linda are the mating pair, and she's been foraging for stuff to build a nest. Seems to me to be quite a therapeutic thing. She's not only helping the soil, of course, but she's building a nest, and she's doing therapeutic work for her instinct to want to reproduce. Okay, so we've talked about person-centeredness, we've talked about agency, we've talked about relation. Let's think about process. Does therapy always involve an act of doing? This was one of the axioms I talked about at the start, that it's something done. Well, I think this is an interesting concept because it implies somebody picking something up and doing something. It implies a conscious, deliberate act. When we know that, certainly on a conscious level, we can't say that therapy is always a conscious act. So is it an act of doing? Do you have to do something to be therapeutic? Or can therapy happen as a natural kind of flux in the universe? Is it something that's just happening? One of the examples, for instance, you might give is of a rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa. The rain falls on parched ground, and the rain is therapeutic in the sense that it provides liquid for the soil and the soil microorganisms and the plant material. It feeds the water aquifers under the sand and the soil. And that can be therapeutic. And the rain keeps coming. And the rain keeps coming, and the rain level rises, the water level rises, and then it floods and it washes soil away, and you get massive erosion. And then it ceases to become something therapeutic, it becomes something destructive. Now, you wouldn't say that there was a conscious act to shift between a therapeutic and a destructive moment, but something happened that was an act of doing. There was something being done. Therapy isn't just a passive process. It seems to be something that is done, even if it's not done in the sense of somebody picking up something and doing something. It's active rather than passive, or so it would seem. But then we introduce the question of death, and I think this is interesting because if we think about death as finality, as absolute, complete finality, then therapy can't be related to death. But we know, for instance, going back to my leaf example, that death is a natural part of the life cycle of all things, death and decay, that leaves die, they fall on the soil, they give their nutrients back to the soil, and then those nutrients form the next cycle of life. And in fact, death is a funny thing philosophically, because really there is no such thing as absolute death. If you think about it from a kind of cosmic level, and after the Big Bang, if death had been actualized as a complete thing, and as a star collapsed and it just died and completely disappeared, then the universe would have disintegrated within about a millisecond after it formed. Because the first moment of death, if it meant complete death, then there would have been nothing to birth the next star or the next whatever structure in the cosmos. So death, in this sense, can't be complete. It's always a process of then rebirth and regeneration. And to some extent, I think this is where Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy comes in, because their philosophy, if it's anything, is a philosophy of genesis, of production, of the production of, if you look around you, everything that you see around you is in a constant state of production, of generating new things, be it chairs on carpets or cars on roads or leaves on trees or oxygen and lungs. It's all constantly like a factory of production. It's fecund, to use the kind of full word. So death and decay, even though it seems terminal to some extent, is a hugely therapeutic process, because it is in that process of changing one thing to another, of this constant cycling of life in the cosmos. And so to talk about, there's no problem, I don't think, really, in talking about death and decay in relation to therapy as part of a therapeutic process, because it's not death in the sense of finality, it's death in the sense of it being part of a looping system that never depletes and decays everything completely, just feeds the next cycle. Okay, let's move on to thinking about the question of purpose. Is therapy goal-directed or purposeful? I think it would be hard to say it would be purposeful in the sense that we know it, and goal-directed in the sense of a human kind of goal-directed, although quite obviously, but it can be. There's nothing to say that a person can't do something therapeutic that is conscious and deliberate, but it can't only be that, because quite clearly there are plenty of things that are done therapeutically that are not meant, that are not intended. So whilst we can say that therapy can be goal-directed and purposeful, in and of itself, you can't define therapy in that way as being just that. So then, in terms of the purpose of therapy, what's it for? Is therapy about restoring equilibrium and harmony? Or actually, is it about liberating movement and destabilizing things? Now, again, we're getting into quite heavy sort of Deleuze and Guattarian philosophy here. Deleuze and Guattari, I think, would say it's the latter. It's very much about liberating movement. They have terms like, they call it territorialization and deterritorialization. They have language of nomads and nomadism. And one of their fundamental ideas in philosophy is to try and engender situations in which people are less constrained in the way that they think. They talk about striated space as something which is full of barriers and obstacles. And our work should be to try and create smooth space, which is like a big flat salt plain where people can move in any direction they want at infinite speed. And that's mentally, conceptually, physically, in every sense. Notice the kind of smooth and striated language is very kind of muscular in the way that they think about it. But Deleuze and Guattari, I think, would definitely say that therapy is an act of liberation rather than restoration. Although, again, it can be to take something back to where it was before, back to normal. And this is actually something Paul and I were talking about the other night, this notion of time as being constantly moving forward, even in death, there's this constant moving forward, means that when you apply some kind of therapy, you're never taking the person back to the state of normal that they were before. You're taking them forward into a new situation. You're constantly liberating them into movement. And the more movement and the more lines of flight, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, that your actions make possible, the more therapeutic that is. But I've used human examples here to try and make it sensible, but think about that in the same way for everything, for any organic or inorganic entity, anything real or virtual, alive or dead, anything, any entity could operate in the same way. And it becomes therapeutic. And this is a proposition. I'm just kind of suggesting this, for instance. It could be that we identify something as therapeutic because it liberates something to move. It liberates movement. It liberates lines of flight, as opposed to constraining and collapsing things down. So I would reject the idea that therapy is about restoring an entity to any kind of true state, because again, this is another kind of issue for Deleuze and Guattari, which is that so often our human notions of how things work therapeutically are transcendental. In other words, they refer to another realm that's not this realm. They refer to, for instance, God. The universe is created by God and everything refers back to God. People think about the reason for therapy is to make themselves a better person in this life so that they'll go to heaven, this other domain. Other religions and other faith groups have different kinds of other places where people go to. in New Zealand, in Aotearoa here, Maori customary beliefs are very much about spirituality, the spirit domain, informing health. And when Maori die, they go off into the spirit domain. This transcendental as well. It's the same with science. Science is transcendental in the sense of thinking that there are universal laws out there in the world to which this world refers. So this isn't an immanent world in scientific sense. This is a copy, an impure copy in a Plato sense, of a world that is like the kind of standard model of how the world should be. All that transcendentalism, Deleuze and Guattari reject. They talk about the notion of immanence. And immanence is that an entity, a thing, a process like therapy doesn't need anything else, doesn't need to refer to any other domain, any other realm, any heaven or earth or science or truth or facts. It just needs to be itself to exist. And so there is no true state to which therapy would refer. There isn't a perfect form of therapy to which this is a copy. There is just this. So is therapy only about repair, or is it also about a function of growth? And that's kind of answered, I think, a couple of slides back when we talked about then returning to normal. There is no return. You're just creating new iterations, new immanent moments in this present. And so repair, rehabilitation, restoration are all about returns back to some prior point, which Deleuze and Guattari and a lot of post-human philosophers would probably reject. That there is no returning, there is no restoration or rehabilitation. There is only forward movement. And each forward movement opens up a possibility for more therapy, more movement, more energy, more creativity, more life. So another one of those axioms is that therapy is a good thing. It's beneficial. But is it always beneficial? Can we say that therapy is always beneficial? Well, I think we can't. There are many times, for instance, when I've done good things for one person and the end result of that's been terrible. I might have, let's take a very extreme example, but there have been times when I worked in neonatal intensive care when my job was to keep that baby alive. But that baby then lived on with horrendous disabilities, awful issues for the parents and the family more widely. It created all kinds of consequences that were just outside of that spun off, that emerged in, therapeutic moments from that moment itself, that then demanded their own therapeutic responses, and on and on and on it went. Now, to apply any kind of moral judgment to any of those things and say, oh, that was a bad thing that happened because of this good thing that happened, is, I think, where the problems reside. Because if you go back to Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil, one of the arguments made in the book is, of course, that the whole question about who determines what's good and what's evil had been dominated by some pretty powerful forces in the past. Economic forces in capitalism, theological forces, particularly in Christianity, in the West particularly, lots of theological forces, lots of economic forces, lots of political forces, moralists who will tell you this is right and this is wrong, utilitarians, ethicists, lots of people with very firm ideas about what is good or bad. But can we define certain therapeutic acts as being good or bad? This is what this question is about. Is there something innately about that kind of therapy, that type of therapy type A, that is good, and this type of therapy type B that is inherently bad? And I'm not sure you can say that, given that each iteration of each immanent moment is only a moment in and of itself. And so each therapeutic moment demands its own relative judgment about whether that therapy is good or bad, and so on. What differentiates therapy from mere accidental collisions and non-therapeutic growth in the cosmos, I think, is a really interesting question. Things collide all the time. And one of the great philosophers of the moment, a philosopher called Quentin Meillassoux, who's comes in to what would be called object-oriented ontology philosophy. He argues that the only way you can explain that we have a universe at all, that things take the shapes that they do, is through mathematics. It's the only framework that can explain it. Because if you think about it, the fact that there are literally billions of collisions going on inside a tiny microscopic atom at every instant, and you multiply that across the whole universe, it is quite astonishing that we have chairs and tables, that we have trees, that we have oxygen that we can breathe. It is quite astonishing. Now, some people will argue that's evidence of a god or an intelligent designer behind the system or some kind of evolutionary process. All of those things exist. People believe those things. Quentin Meillassoux would argue that the only way you can understand this is through mathematics and through understanding object-oriented relations between things. But there has to be something that differentiates therapeutic interaction between things and just a banging together in an accidental collision, which implies then that there is some purpose involved in that collision. So two entities collide, they have a therapeutic effect, and it's not just the kind of accidental collision that entity had with another thing a few milliseconds ago. This has a different order to it. It implies some kind of purpose. But where does that purpose reside? If we're talking about something that's not at a conscious level, what would differentiate that collision that has a therapeutic effect from just a collision that does nothing? So that question is one of the things that I think is particularly interesting philosophically. And I think we can I have a notion of what, for me, reading Deleuze and Guattari, what that is. And that's very broadly, and Philip and Matt and I have just written a chapter for the new Critical Physio Network anthology, which will hopefully come out next year, which talks a little bit about this. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the shock of thought. Now, thought is not something they talk about as being human. Thought is the response that every entity has when it's challenged, when something threatens it. Now, if you think of an oxygen molecule, when it comes up against the alveolar wall, in a sense, from a Deleuzian point of view, it is thrown into thought because now it has a problem of how to navigate its way through. It's difficult to talk about this without kind of anthropomorphizing it, but you can imagine that there is a challenge to that oxygen molecule that wasn't there a millisecond ago. That provokes it into thought, and that thought is an expression of its properties. It's a shock, much like a person who is playing soccer and their ACL ruptures. Suddenly, instantaneously, they are shocked into a thought or a series of thoughts that were not there 20 seconds before. Deleuze and Guattari would say that happens to everything. Every time the wind hits a window pane, both entities are shocked into thought. So thought is a creative urge in Deleuze and Guattari's work. I think to some extent you could argue that the therapeutic process is the response to that shock of thought. The response that means the oxygen molecule passes through into the plasma and doesn't just get absorbed by a macrophage and eaten. Or maybe that's a shock of thought, to which that's the therapeutic effect, and it's great for the macrophage, not so great for the oxygen molecule. But the therapeutic process, I think you could argue, is a direct response to that shock of thought, and so is available to every entity all the time, anywhere. And it's not a purposeful act in being conscious, but it's available as a way in which that entity can resolve the problem or that shock of thought into some kind of new future, new possibility. So this, in a sense, is what makes touch therapeutic touch and not just accidentally bump into somebody on the subway. Okay, there are two aspects of I keep losing touch. Two aspects of therapy that we need to consider and just unpack a little bit. The first one's time, the second one's space. If we look at therapy temporally, we need to ask, when does therapy actually occur? Does it have a beginning and an end? I said at the start with those axioms that you can think of therapy as something that's episodic. Patient comes into the clinic, I do some therapy, they go away again, that's the end of it. But we know that that's not the case. It may well be for that person that they were thinking about coming to the physio a week ago. And so in some ways, mentally preparing themselves, doing work off therapy long before they actually had the encounter with you. And maybe the therapy began when they actually had their injury or their illness, or when things started for them, or maybe in childhood when they fell out of a tree and they first learned about what it's like to have a broken arm, and now that's brought into the present when they're thinking about this current problem. It's very hard to say that the therapy itself begins at 12 o'clock on a Thursday, hence the title of this talk, the wind will see you now. Equally, it's very difficult to say when the therapy finishes, because the person might be thinking about that therapy long after they've gone. They might be doing more work on it. The actual treatment that you might apply in the clinic might have latent effects that don't manifest for another 48 hours. Those effects might have effects on effects. It's almost impossible, I would say, for us to be able to distinguish a beginning and an end point to therapy. And in some cultures, Maori culture here in New Zealand, there's a belief that your present health is very much a product of the health of your whānau, your family, going back and generation after generation after generation. I come from a family of English Midlands coal miners, and I'm sure that some of the ways I think about my health are related to my grandfather's coal mining experiences, and then his, and so on and so on. So as a process, temporally, I think it's very difficult for us to talk about therapy as having a beginning and an end, or at least a definitive beginning and an end. And I don't see why that should be any different for oxygen molecules than it is for me in a clinic setting. So how long do therapeutic effects persist for? I think they are potentially limitless. And so then, which raises another question, if I can just jump ahead, I'll come back to this in a second. We'll come back to this question in a second, but it's, well, then what determines why they decay, or when do they stop? I mentioned about Maori customary beliefs about historical trauma. It's a big thing here in New Zealand. The issues of colonization play very heavily in our politics here. And the question about the downstream effects of that are always talked about, particularly in healthcare. And one of the things that's taken for granted here is that from a Maori point of view, the trauma of colonization is playing out not just in the daily politics of life here, and the fact that Maori have the worst health statistics, have the worst access to healthcare, all of the kind of things that are common in colonized countries, colonized peoples. Their belief is that there is something in the spiritual connection with their ancestors that carries this historical trauma forward. But I think we could also argue at the same time that there's a possibility temporally that therapy is also historical and carried forward. Why shouldn't therapy be carried forward in the same way as trauma? Because if it is some kind of universal process that's accessible and available to all, then at least on one level, much like I used the example of time before, it's never going to disappear. It might be applied or not applied, but the concept of therapy is always available, just like time is always available, is always moving. You can never stop time or obliterate time. Perhaps it's the same with therapy. Maybe there are echoes that continue continuously through generations. And I find that a very warming feeling, that the idea that there might be historical therapies as much as we could acknowledge historical traumas. So this is a question I raised earlier. So if we are not sure when therapy begins and ends, we ought to be thinking a little bit about then what determines how it decays and ceases. Why would therapy not remain at the same intensity as it did 10 seconds ago? Why is it depleting? What is depleting it and what's decaying it? And equally, what causes it to persist? What causes some therapies to remain continuously working and others to decay into almost nothing? This is a question I'm going to really struggle to try and explain, but this is an idea that comes from post-human philosophy, and particularly in Deleuze and Guattarian philosophy. And it's the idea that the therapeutic act has already been worked through by the time it manifests. So the example that I've used before to talk about this would come from Erin Manning, who is a tango dancer. And she looks at tango dancing, and I've written about this a lot, but she looks at tango dancing and she says, if you're watching a film of tango dancers and you stop the video at any moment, there are 1,000 things that could go wrong in that dance. One person could roll their arm out, a person could shift their balance, 1,000 things could be done, and each one of them could be catastrophic. The people could fall on the floor and make complete fools of themselves and turn this beautiful, sensuous dance into something that looks ridiculous. So there is real jeopardy here. Somehow, the dancers, and this is the genius of the dance, they resolve those 1,000 tensions into one response that continues that flow, that continues the beauty of the dance. The next instant, of course, they're then confronted with another 1,000 problems that they have to confront, and on it goes, on and on and on. This is the shock of thought all the time, this shock, all the time needing to be resolved. But what Erin Manning talks about, she uses the phrase pre-acceleration, is that by the time that the decision is made that they're going to move in this way, really the 1,000 things that could have gone wrong have just been resolved and collapsed into the one thing, and that's it, done. So in a sense, that decision kills the juice and the danger and the jeopardy in the dance until another 1,000 things emerges and the juice comes back again. So the shock of thought is confronted by a therapeutic act, which is to collapse these things into the one, which then opens up a new set of thoughts and a new set of problems. So what Erin Manning's basically talking about here is that the work of movement in a dance is happening when those 1,000 things are alive and the couple has to resolve them. It's not when they collapse into one thing, because that's kind of the death, that's the end of it, it's resolved, finished. It's when those 1,000 things are alive. So she says the work of movement, the movement itself, happens actually before the movement manifests and they actually go like that. It's already happened because the movement's already been done. Or maybe therapy works the same way. Maybe the therapeutic response is in that moment when they go, here's 1,000 problems, different movements we could do, let's resolve into this one thing. They operationalize a therapeutic decision that has already been made prior to that moment. So it's in milliseconds that it happens, and it happens continuously. Every time you walk on the floor, every time you drive your car, every time the wind blows against a window, every time the sea comes into the shore, every time an airplane flies in the air, it's happening continuously, this process of movement, always movement and always shocks of thought and always therapeutic responses. So is therapy ever achievable? I would think we'd have to say no. I don't think therapy can ever be completed, both temporally in terms of when does it decay and finish, but also when you could say, okay, that therapeutic episode has stopped. So because if I'm kind of I'm kind of drifting towards this idea that therapy is a process. It's not a property of the thing itself. It's a process that circles around everything and makes that kind of movement possible, but it's not held by the thing itself. If that's the case, then it's never completed, it's never achieved, it's never done. It's always a process in flux, it's always moving. It's never begun or ended. You can't think about it in a temporal sense in that way. So what about spatial? Can we understand therapy more in spatial context? Well, then, as before, we've got to try and put some boundaries around this. Is therapy confined to its immediate environment surrounding the entities? At the beginning with those axioms, one of the things was that it's therapy happens in the clinic room between me and the patient. That's the kind of very simplistic way that physiotherapists tend to look at this thing. But in a sense, spatially, what is involved in that therapeutic moment, even if we took the patient in the clinic, there is a treatment bed that was made 5 years ago by somebody that they're now lying on that's having a therapeutic benefit. The air that they were breathing came from an air conditioning unit that was bringing air from not far away. The therapist is using training that comes from 10 years prior. What point spatially can you say that this is contained within this room? So many things are being brought into that room to make that therapeutic experience possible. Just the fact that those people are in the space at all is a product of an enormous range of trajectories. And similarly, as the therapeutic effects happen, they ripple outwards. The person goes away from that clinic room with a new understanding maybe of a particular thing that they go and tell their niece, and their niece tries it themselves, and they go and tell their friends, and then they go back to their workplace and they adjust their seating position in their chair, and their computer changes. The kind of spatial effects of what they do ripple out. And again, why should that be any different to any entity? So what are the spatial limits? Not just temporally, when does therapy stop? Where does it stop? What are its spatial limits? And I think just like with the temporal question, where what decays, what causes that decay to happen, the same could apply here. Spatially, it seems like the therapy ripples out, multiple ripples in multiple directions, and cannot be bounded. And be very difficult to put a limit around saying, right, it stops here. So then the question, who or what decides where and when it stops? Unless it's going to carry on at the same intensity with the same kind of therapeutic ripple at the same kind of pitch all the time, which would probably make the world very chaotic and very noisy. And I don't mean noisy just in terms of sound. I mean noisy in terms of experiences of the world. There must be some way in which those effects, those therapeutic effects decay, maybe never ceasing. But other things happen in the world, new things, new therapeutic challenges, new shocks happen to things that then add to the ripples without just making just an enormous cacophony of therapeutic noise. I like that bit at the end of that film. Talk about shock of thought. Okay, so we're nearly right at the end now of the questions, and I wanted to end with really a series of questions about limits. This word in here, limitrophic, is a really nice word. It comes from Derrida, who coined the phrase to refer to entities and things that are interested in boundaries and borders, things that explore boundaries and limits of things, and sometimes construct boundaries, but also make them porous. So I suppose we have to ask some quite basic questions of therapy. The first one being, well, what's the opposite of therapy? If therapy is something specific and it isn't everything, then it has limits. So can we say what it isn't, or what the opposite of it is? Because and still apply the same kind of ideas that have come through these questions about it being maybe a process, about it not just being a human thing, about being shared by all entities, about being temporally and spatially amorphous and distributed. Can we apply the same logic and principles to when we're talking about what is its opposite? Because it would be very easy to apply just human logic here and say therapy is hurting someone. But we've said that hurting people actually can be therapeutic. We do it all the time in physiotherapy. We provoke people's pain so we can find out where the problem is. We will do a lot of things that hurt people in the act of therapy. So we got to get away from some of the kind of more simplistic, humanistic ways of thinking about therapy and what its opposite is, and apply the same kind of logic and principles and questions to it, I suppose, this opposite as to therapy itself. What is the difference between therapy, healing, care, and help? Is there a difference? I mean, beyond just a human construct that allows some groups to claim some language and others not. We don't use the word healing particularly as much in the orthodox Western context as it's used, for instance, in the alternative and complementary therapies. Physiotherapists don't tread too much on the nursing claim to own care for political reasons, but is there anything that is allows nurses to claim care as being something they do more than other people? Those are human political questions and all very valid questions. But I think on a deeper level, philosophically, we've got to ask similar questions about those other comparable terms like healing, care, and help in relation to therapy to see if we can tease apart some differences at a universal, cosmic, ecological level. And this is a real puzzle, this one. Is there anything that can't be therapeutic? For it to be therapeutic, it implies that it is distinctive. It's something different to accidental collisions between things. So maybe an accidental collision is not therapeutic. And maybe that's the only thing. Maybe anything that is a therapeutic response to a shock of thought, or is any response to a shock of thought, could be therapeutic. Or does the response to the shock of thought have to be in a particular direction? Does it have to open up movement and open up the possibility for lines of flight and immersion and creativity, as opposed to closing it down? And I think this, to some extent, speaks to the broader point about this question about therapy. And we get into the question now, then, what does all this mean? I think if you look at the recent moves in physiotherapy to broaden the scope, I think there's a broad acceptance in the profession now that the old body as machine idea isn't enough, and that physiotherapy needs to expand. We've seen expansion into areas like qualitative research and a lot of interest in people's subjective lived experience, even in some senses towards phenomenology. We've seen a move towards person-centered practice. We've seen the emergence of supposedly holistic models like the biopsychosocial model. We've seen much more focus on emancipatory talk, particularly around gender and a post-colonial critique and critical disability activism, so a more sociologically orientated voice towards emancipating the voice of the marginalized other, anti-oppressive practice. We've seen those kind of frontiers emerging on the surface of physiotherapy. But to all intents and purposes, they've been towards an enhanced form of humanism. They've said we'll go from the body as machine, and in putting that to one side or rejecting the body as machine and that kind of biological rationale in physiotherapy, we're going to move towards a humanistic rationale. And so we're going to immerse ourselves in people's subjective experience. We're going to immerse ourselves into the social world of healthcare, but it's the world of the human being. So very much physiotherapy has not just stayed with the human, in some respects has actually become more humanistic. Now that's interesting from an eco-philosophical point of view, because it seems to me that when we look at questions like that, what is therapy? One of the inescapable points that you have to come to is that from the very first step, it can't be just a human thing. It extends way beyond just a human thing. So from our point of view politically, from our professional point of view, are we just going to stick with therapy for humans by humans? In which case, then, we're going to have a whole vocabulary to explain why the oxygen molecule that I bagged into that person's lung can't be therapeutic. It's just Dave being therapeutic for this patient. And we're going to have to explain that philosophically and then account for that and explain then why we differentiate, what we're going to call all that stuff that the oxygen's doing instead. Because that's clearly having therapeutic benefit. I mean, I'm not doing anything at the level of mitochondria. The oxygen is. I might be helping it to get there, but I can't claim that I'm doing the therapeutic work on my own when there's clearly so much other stuff going on. And therapy is clearly vastly bigger than anything we've accounted for in the past. So when we go back to those opening questions, it seems to me that we can say some things about the axioms that physiotherapy has held to in the past. Is therapy done by people for people? Well, okay, sometimes, but not necessarily. Is it a conscious act, something done purposefully? Again, often, but not necessarily. Does it always require another? Well, if it's a process and it's something entities have access to, then you might argue that there is always a relationship involved in therapy in some level, but it's not a person-to-person relationship necessarily. It could be an oxygen molecule and a mitochondria. It could be the wind and a window. Is it something that's always beneficially good? No, it can often be harmful. It can be bad. It can be death, but it can still be therapeutic. Is it something that requires skill to administer? Not if we're calling skill something that is just a human conscious attribute. Skill could be the ability for relationships to form and for the entities to respond therapeutic to the shock of thought. If we call that skill, then we could say yes. But I don't think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about skill. We're talking about skill as something you learn in college. Is it something distinctive from healing, caring, or helping? We don't really know, because those concepts haven't really been exposed to these kind of questions like therapy yet. Is it episodic, having a clear beginning and end? No, we clearly see that spatially and temporally it ripples out in all kinds of directions. Is it confined to its immediate actors and environment? No. Is it about repair, rehabilitation, or restoration, the return to some prior state? From a Deleuzean Guattarian point of view, you would have to say no. that it's about the progress of movement forward, and there is no kind of circling back. You're creating new iterations, new imminent moments. So what can we say about therapy now then? I think you can say maybe these things, and this is my last slide. Therapy may well be, and I don't know if we can be definitive about these things, mind independent. In other words, it happens even if things are not consciously aware of them. Therapy is happening regardless of the human mind. That it's common to all entities, that it's a relentless event or process, not a property of a thing, that it's a response to the shock of thought, that it's temporally and spatially boundless, that it's amoral in the sense of it doesn't determine whether that's a good or a bad thing. Its only interest is in producing difference and movement. And it's a fundamental part of life, life being that kind of thought that all entities engage in, to use the word from Spinoza, in their conatus, in their desire to persist. So this coffee cup has a desire to carry on being a coffee cup. It does not want to be a motorway. It doesn't want to be a vacuum cleaner. It just wants to be a coffee cup and has a conatus and a desire somewhere within it to retain its coffee cupness and not dissolve into an atmosphere, into the universe, into an atmosphere of 1 billion particles. We don't understand what that process is, but I think we could argue that therapy is a vastly misunderstood and vital part of that process, through which this coffee cup remains a coffee cup and sits on the tabletop and does its job. And so in that sense, I think from a physiotherapy point of view, one of the ways in which we're starting to now rethink physiotherapy is really blowing the doors off the old idea that it's confined to those things and opening up the possibility that it engages in a much wider cosmology of ideas that probably get closer to explaining why the physical therapies have persisted for so long, why for thousands of years they've been one of the mainstays of people's therapeutic work, but not just the work of people, but the work of everything around us. Okay. Done. Thank you all for staying.
Thanks, Dave. So on the note of your question of can anything ever not be therapeutic, is it maybe this talk? Jokes aside, this has been a kind of, a philosophical broadside of the potential of really thinking through environmental physiotherapy, I would say. It was meant that way. It was never meant to be a kind of, nice and easy session that doesn't really bring us anything new and doesn't provoke our thinking. I hope and I'm sure it's done that. I suppose that we've scheduled the session for 2 hours, initially, which leaves us with about 11 minutes right now. If anybody has sort of the processing ability to ask a question now or give a comment now, I suppose we can open the floor to that. We are recording the session though for headache-inducing reviews of it. But yeah, the floor is open maybe just for another few minutes.
Okay, I would like to give a comment or ask something, even though it's recorded. Thank you for the talk, David. A lot of question is raised by me, and a lot of thoughts are coming to my head. And I totally agree with you that physiotherapy needs to broaden their definition and scope of practice. But I'm thinking a little bit about the word therapy that you have talked about now. Several questions. If there's kind of a difference in the word occupational therapy in respect of physiotherapy, and also the word therapy, for me, we kind of have abandoned it, at least in research. I mean, looking at physiotherapy as a concept, and we're more into looking at the mechanism of actions, and that can be so broad, all these mechanism actions. That's therapy, as you said, can be like how we encounter the patient and what the things we're doing, the interventions. But for me, it's more about the mechanism of actions more than the concept of therapy. It was a lot of questions there, I know. But why are you so into the kind of word therapy, since we kind of have abandoned it in at least in research?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a couple of thoughts I have on that, and I'd really appreciate, other people's thoughts on it too. It's still in our name. It's still, we haven't abandoned it in our name. We still politically use it to imply to people that we're going to help them. And so we couldn't give that up. I mean, if we changed our name to be, we are physio mechanics of action, I don't think people would come as much. So we have to do that. But I also think maybe therapy has gone somewhat out of fashion because the trend these days is much more towards a neoliberal idea about people have to look after the health of themselves. They have to be personally responsible for their health, and we want to be promoting and emancipating and all this kind of stuff. So the idea of therapy has a kind of implication of some kind of passive being done to. You come for therapy, I do the therapy to you. But this is to some extent, I think, why I'm interested in it, because if you abandon that idea and see therapy as vastly different to that, as much broader, much more interesting, then it maybe has a place still within physiotherapy, but only if it's understood in a more realistic way, rather than a political sense of which it was originally applied. If you think about, for instance, the very early, in America, there was a big contest between the doctors in the early 1900s who had the word physiotherapy as their title. And they actually fought to keep it, and they didn't want to become physiatrists, but there was a contest, a power to establish who can claim that name, because they wanted this idea of therapy. But as medicine became more interested in germs and the biological body in terms of its biochemistry, they stopped being that interested in actually hands-on helping people, literally hands-on helping, doing the things that we picked up. And they were happy to sort of delegate that to other people, the practical work of hydrotherapy and massage and electric exercise and stuff, because it was seen to have a bit less status than the biochemistry that they were moving into. So it was really a political move. And I see that sort of thing happening in physiotherapy now as a political move to get away from that image of passivity, of you come and have your back fixed, that kind of thing, which isn't to me what therapy is at all, but it's been mobilized from a political point of view for that argument, I think.
Yeah, and it might be also, the word therapy might be different in different parts of the world. I mean, in some parts of the world, therapy is more like hands-on and passive, but in other parts, it's more about teaching, learning the patient to appreciate, for example, as you said, touch by the leaf or something, that we are more like a facilitator of having the patients doing their therapeutic work by themselves. So I guess it's kind of different in different parts of the world on how we interpret the word therapy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Richard.
Hi, David. I wanted to ask you a question, but I'm aware of my philosophical ignorance in asking this. In that you were looking, one question which particularly stood out was, well, what is the opposite of therapy? And you cautioned against using a reductionist humanist perspective of harm. And something that kind of struck me from an ecological perspective is the difference between harm and violence. As in, is violence the antithesis of therapy? Because harm is going to happen within natural processes. A carnivore is going to harm the herbivore upon which it produces the milk which feeds its children. The bacteria and fungi that are going to consume us from the inside out are causing us harm, but returning our elemental structures to the soil. That it's part of the cycle. But violence is something that exists only in a context of moral agency. A wolf is not being violent towards the deer. it might be causing it harm, but violence is a function of sentience, of reflective ability, of moral agency. Is that a reasonable avenue to discuss or explore in terms of the antithesis of therapy?
I suppose possibly, but I think that one of the problems is because it's a kind of human moral agential principle. You would struggle to apply it to other situations which you might say, if you took a broader definition, would consider to be violent. So, for instance, I use an example of the rain on the sub-Saharan Africa. The rain falls on the desert gets, the aquifers rise, the seeds get water, they've been parched. You would say that's therapeutic. And then the rain keeps coming and it floods and it destroys the landscape. Then suddenly that becomes a violent flood. Violent, I'm using the word carefully here, but a violent flood, which is now not therapeutic. It actually looks pretty harmful. But of course, that washed away soil flows down the river and provides fresh water for a community down the river that hasn't had water for a long time, and maybe sends sediment into the sea that produces the material for new coral growth in the water. So what's harm for one and violent for one is helpful to another. If you can't use the word violence for those kind of situations, we're back in that situation of we're going to colonize a set of words for humans that are broadly around heart therapy, including violence, because they imply some kind of moral agency. And we're going to have to find a whole vocabulary, different vocabulary, for things that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa when the rain falls. And so I think that's a really valid question to ask. But I don't have a problem in talking about the violence of a flood, for instance, without actually applying a kind of moral agency to it. I think it's something to do with like an intensity and its destructive capacity. But then again, you get into trouble because what's destruction for one is food for another. What's that phrase? I mean, you use wolves. There's a phrase about that. What's food for the wolves is death for the sheep.
Oh, was it? I think it was the pike and the minnow. It was an old story about landlordism in the UK.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know that if we're going to use language which we feel works in a kind of anthropomorphic sense, like violence implies a moral agency, a morality to it, then we have to be careful because we then can't use that to describe a traumatic flood. So what are we going to use? Because there's something therapeutic going on there too, but now we can't use that word because we can only apply it to humans. So maybe the human definition is too narrow. We need to use the word violence, but in a broader context. Same with therapy. I don't know. I really don't know.
I'll use that for a closing word. The broadening of our concepts and the broadening of the concept of therapy. I think it's in this way that your talk today was therapeutic, at least in the sense that you've been describing, in the sense that it allows us maybe hopefully to think of therapy, physiotherapy, environmental physiotherapy in much broader ways, and with this term environmental physiotherapy that we set talking about 5.5 years ago in Auckland, I think it was already a play on this, right? A play on what therapy might mean, and so it's great to go to this depth here today, and I will quite violently close this session now and stop the recording with no